Live from Pacific Junction Hotel, Girth Radio.
Hello? Hey, Sammy, how are you?
You ready to roll?
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Yo, welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy Younan. I'm super excited today to be talking to David Peisner. He wrote a book called Homey, Don't Play That, The Story of In Living Color and the Black Comedy Revolution. Introduce yourself, what the book is about. This is fantastic.
Well, thanks. The book is called Homey, Don't Play That, and it's about in living color and black comedy. Kind of, I could probably do a better job than that. I'm really sorry. I've just had my head in a bunch of other stories the last couple of days, but yeah, it's Homie, Don't Play That. It's about in living color and the black comedy revolution. So it's kind of looking at black comedy, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, but really through the lens of in living color.
Mm-hmm. And I assume you went back and rewatched many of the sketches for this book. Where there were some that were funnier than you remembered, or some that didn't age well?
Oh yeah, definitely. I went back and watched the whole show, and in some spots watched things over and over. But there were some that I didn't even remember from when the show was originally on that really struck me. I mean, I remember one. There's a sketch that. I don't know, people don't really talk about it because it was only on once, but it's called Timbuk, the Runaway Slave, and it's Damon Wayans playing the last runaway slave, playing a slave whose family and descendants have been in this cave for generations, and it's just so sharp and so pointed and barbed and angry and funny. I mean, it's the kind of thing that could be on the air today without any updating. And, just as funny, just as powerful. There are other stuff that definitely has not aged that well. Some of the men on film stuff, I mean, the way that people talk about, LGBT issues now is with a lot more sensitivity. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of that stuff was particularly mean-spirited back then. But as I remember when I interviewed Keenen, and I think when I interviewed David Allen Greer about both of them said there's no way that sketch would have made it on the air today. It's just sensitivities are different now.
Mm-hmm. As I was reading the book too, I went back and started YouTubing a number of the clips, and I found Handyman fascinating because I found this coming from the same comedy space as being black in America, just like the racism that you kind of encounter. It reminded me of the Jeff Foxworthy, You Might Be a Redneck If. It's in the culture and of the culture, but it's not making fun of the people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, Handyman was a really interesting one. I remember talking to Damon about that. And, because, he felt like he had some insight into that world because he was actually born with a club foot. He had a pretty significant disability when he was younger. Obviously as he got older, you couldn't really tell anymore. But, and it was always what is more, empowering for, any sort of minority group than to make them a superhero. Mm-hmm. So, and I can't remember, there was a writer who I spoke to, I think it was this guy Foxx Barr, who was one of the, one of the kind of prominent writers who were on the show for several seasons. And he had told me, I might be crediting the wrong guy, but I do remember one of the writers had told me that they had tried to do a version of Handyman at Saturday Night Live a couple of years before, and it just didn't work because it didn't have that kind of sensitivity to it, and it didn't have that sort of underdog spirit to it. There's, it's that combination of the writing and then the performers sort of sensing just the right amount of I guess sensitivity, I guess.
The Handyman sketches have a lot of heart in them. They're funny, but they have a lot of heart, and it's it sounds offensive a little bit when you say it out loud. He's like a handicapped superhero, and he's up and away,
exactly.
And he falls out the window and stuff like that. But they are funny, and they have a lot of heart, and I'm like, oh man, this stuff's gold.
Yeah, and I'm just remembering now, the Foxx made them screen those for sort of like a disability rights group because they were worried that they were going to get a lot of pushback on that. But people who came in who actually had disabilities loved it. Like, across the board, everyone thought it was fantastic, and that was kind of like the end of that argument, I guess.
Yeah. This idea too that the shows were edgy or might be offensive to certain groups or certain people. You mentioned Men in Film. We talked about Handyman already. Can you talk about the 1992 Super Bowl and how like revolutionary that was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was an idea that it was. It's hard to remember now, but like the Super Bowl halftime show prior to that year was nothing. I mean, like culturally, it was like, college marching bands, Las Vegas, like magic acts. Like it was not this big thing that people, complain about or, lose their mind over or talk about for days and days before and after. It was nothing. It was a time to go fill your bowl with chips, go to the bathroom, whatever. And so, this is an idea that actually came from the network. Well, actually, originally from this guy who was sort of this sports marketing guy outside the network, but then he sort of brought it to the network and said, what if we do this? And eventually, Keenen loved the idea and thought, it's fantastic. And they knew, the whole idea before that was that no one would go against the Super Bowl. No one would program. There was no counter programming against the Super Bowl because it was seen as there weren't enough viewers to make it worthwhile. People just put on reruns on the other channels if you didn't, because everyone was going to watch the Super Bowl. And, they calculated at Fox that it was, we only need this many people to turn the channel to make it a big deal. Mm-hmm. And they got a lot more than that. I'll tell you what the numbers were: 20 million, 25 million people, changed the channel from the Super Bowl. But they were also, because normally In Living Color was taped. It wasn't live. So this was the first time they'd had on a live show. And so there was a huge amount of worry about, what the performers might say, what they might do. So there was a 5-second delay that they put that the network insisted upon. But then sort of at the one moment that ended up becoming sort of, the point that perhaps they should have pushed that button, they didn't. In fact, the guy I remember interviewing the executive whose job it was to alert the standards and practices people that, we need to push that delay button because something was said that we shouldn't go out on air. And he told me I blew it because I was laughing too hard at the joke. And, that's what happened. And so it ended up being I think the way I described it in the book was something like it was exactly the kind of, sort of conflict or it created as much of a ruckus as you really wanted. Like everyone was talking about it, but no one really got sued. No one lost their broadcasting license. It was enough to get people talking about it, but not enough to cause any real problem. But the main, takeaway from that was that the next year, Michael Jackson did the Super Bowl halftime, and that was the beginning of, Super Bowl halftimes as we know it.
Yeah. What was the moment, or what was the joke that was the they should have pushed the button on the screen?
Oh God! So it was Men On. They were doing a Men On football, and I believe the joke was they were making fun. At the time there was this sort of widely traveled rumor that about Richard Gere and a gerbil, and and so it was this sort of it was in the culture. People sort of knew the joke, but Damon made a reference to it, and it just went out on air, and that was the end of that. They also made a reference to Carl Lewis, the Olympic sprinter, essentially being a gay. And that went out over the air, and so both of those, both of those, I believe, happened in the course of about 10 seconds of this one sketch.
Yeah.
But no one pushed the button to kind of bleep them out, and it was fun. In the end, it was fine.
So you talk about how In Living Color changed Super Bowl and kind of had a cultural impact. How was its legacy in terms of like comedy and what it contributed to like the culture?
Those kind of things are always, it's obviously all sort of open to interpretation. But, I think you can look, I sort of looked at In Living Color as part of this hinge point in our culture, in sort of pop culture. And this moment, and I wouldn't say it was alone in that moment. There were other things happening in the culture, things like the Arsenio Hall show, some of like the best Spike Lee movies. There were a couple of other like Robert Townsend movies, but there were these things and that were happening like late 80s, early 90s that were kind of opening up kind of mainstream culture to all of this African American culture. And so if you look at kind of culture before and culture after, pop culture now is essentially run by Black culture. That it sets the agenda for pop culture. In the early 80s, it was very much a kind of a fringe thing. I mean, of course, people knew who Richard Pryor was and, Bill Cosby and things like this, but it didn't really, it was just a part of a sort of corner of popular culture, whereas, now it's everything. And I wouldn't say that In Living Color did that alone, but I think it was part of this moment in time where that was changing. And it wasn't just changing in comedy or in TV. You saw it in music with, the rise of hip hop. You saw it in films. You saw it, you saw it sort of across the board. I mean, even in things like politics, the mid 80s was sort of when Jesse Jackson first started sort of winning Democratic primaries and things like that. I mean, there was a lot going on, and in a way, that was sort of my real inspiration for writing the book. It was a kind of a way to tell that story. And In Living Color, it was a point where kind of all these things tended to come together. A lot of the people. So Richard Pryor was obviously a huge influence on Keenen and Damon. Eddie Murphy was obviously a huge influence on them. In Living Color itself did a lot of work to make hip hop more mainstream. At the time, hip hop was something that you kind of it was very much still seen as a fad. It was on the coasts. It was L.A. and New York and a couple of other big cities. It was big, but in the middle of America, it was like there weren't hip hop radio stations, things like that. All of a sudden, In Living Color is putting groups like A Tribe Called Quest or De La Soul or KRS-One. They're Black Sheep. They're putting them on in prime time. There was no one else who was putting these guys on prime time. I mean, you had certainly not on network TV. I mean, Yo MTV Raps was going on, but that's again cable. And this is a time that not everyone had cable TV. Arsenio was putting them on, but he's putting them on late night. So I mean, all these things are happening at the same time. But In Living Color was a real kind of conduit for a lot of this culture.
I want to pick up on the Richard Pryor thread for a moment because you had a great line on page 47 of the book. You said the story of the rise and fall of the Richard Pryor show is amusing, infuriating, and in many ways completely predictable. Why did you choose to write about Living Color rather than the Richard Pryor show? You clearly had an affection in writing about the Richard Pryor show, and I mean we need more bios, just kind of documenting Richard Pryor's show and what that also kind of gave us culturally too.
Well, I think some of the reason is very sort of. There were only 4 episodes of Richard Pryor show, so
yeah.
Like it's going to be a short book.
Yeah.
But and there also had been. There have been some good books about Richard Pryor. I wish I had them on the top. I read 2 of them, and one of them was by Scott Sauls. I don't know. I can't remember the guy's name. But there's been a fair bit written about Richard Pryor, and deservedly so. There have been documentaries and things like that. In Living Color had kind of coasted a little bit under the radar. And not just in that there had been no books about it, but you didn't really see a lot of like magazine stories about it. You didn't see, I think it had just been a little bit forgotten. And In Living Color itself only lasted basically about 4.5 seasons. And so it didn't become the institution that Saturday Night Live did. But anyway, but to get back to Richard Pryor, he was sort of the ground zero for a lot of this humor. And I think the Richard Pryor show itself was so far ahead of its time. I mean, when you look at some of those sketches, I mean, they're very artsy and avant-garde, and he wasn't afraid to not be funny. Mm-hmm. And I think that was like a really kind of a brave thing. And I, the things that I see in the Richard Pryor show, I mean, when you look at a show like Atlanta, Donald Glover's show, I feel like that is really kind of, the weirdness of a show like Atlanta is a real direct descendant of the Richard Pryor show.
Yeah.
I think and certainly there are parts of the Richard Pryor show that, of course, were a big influence on In Living Color. But I think when Keenen talked about Richard Pryor as an influence, he's thinking about like the kind of all of Richard Pryor's career and not just that show, because Richard Pryor's movies, his stand-up, those are the kind of things that were kind of more direct influences, I think, on In Living Color.
Yeah, Richard Pryor had a huge body of work.
Yeah. And I mean, and Richard Pryor was, I mean, it's also a different time. The Richard Pryor show, whereas if you look, and when I said that it was predictable that it was going to fail, mm-hmm. I mean, you only had to just sort of look at what that show was and what it was dropping into sort of culturally. There was nothing, there was nothing in film, there was nothing in TV that kind of laid the groundwork for it. Whereas, just like what I was saying before, with In Living Color, it arrived at exactly the right time. Arsenio was already on the air. Eddie movies like 48 Hours and Trading Places, Beverly Hills Cop, like those things were already in the culture. Spike Lee, like Do the Right Thing, had already happened. Like all of that groundwork. Robert Townsend, Hollywood Shuffle, which Keenen obviously wrote for, all of that stuff had already happened. Yeah. And so when In Living Color came along, although there were tons of people who were being exposed to a lot of these things for the first time, a lot of the work had been done. And it had been done, by people like Richard Pryor.
And you just touched upon Eddie Murphy. Everyone kind of knows his cultural impact, like you mentioned, Beverly Hills Cop, his work on Saturday Night Live, those kind of things. Eddie also has a kind of unrecognized pop culture contribution in terms of his friendship with Keenen and Ivory Wayans that a lot of people kind of don't really know or overlook. Can you kind of elaborate on that friendship and how that kind of influenced In Living Color?
Yeah. I mean, so Keenen and Eddie were very tight. They had met, as comics, stand-ups coming up in New York, and there became this group, and I read about this a little bit in the book, that became, they christened themselves the Black Pack. And this was Eddie and Keenen and Robert Townsend and Arsenio and Paul Mooney, who is an older comic, but, is probably best known as being Richard Pryor's kind of personal writer. I mean, he wrote a lot for Richard Pryor. But anyway, these guys hung out together. They kind of, they worked together some. But Eddie broke through and broke big long, before any of these guys did. And I think there was some, particularly between Arsenio and Keenen, a little bit of sharp elbows of like who's going to be next after Eddie. But, Eddie was pretty generous, in terms of giving people opportunities, giving people credit. Keenen was a producer for Eddie's stand-up special Raw. I think I have that right. I'm a little bit I haven't thought about this stuff in a while, but I'm pretty sure that's right. It was either for Raw or Delirious, but I'm pretty sure it was Raw. But he was also Keenen's first movie which was before In Living Color, the blaxploitation send-up. I'm gonna get you, sucker. That was Eddie's idea, mm-hmm. And Eddie gave it to him. And he said, I'm not going to do anything with it. You can have it. And so Eddie really did look out for his friends and did try to, put them on. And, he was kind of as one person who had worked with Eddie and then later became a producer on In Living Color, said like Eddie was kind of like the secret godfather of In Living Color.
Mm-hmm. That's a great line.
And if you look, right, yeah, and if you look at also like what Eddie had done on Saturday Night Live, like that also was laying the groundwork for In Living Color. I mean, in fact, you know, the fact that Eddie was by that time had left Saturday Night Live and was, you know, obviously well into a movie career, and that they had never really replaced Eddie with anyone who was sort of bringing black culture to Saturday Night Live, that opened up the door for In Living Color to exist. And in a very direct way. I mean, you know, this woman, Tamara Rowett, who was the same person I was just referring to before, who was a producer on In Living Color and who had worked with Eddie before, she was one of the people close to Keenen right at the beginning when they were first getting In Living Color off the ground. And, you know, she and Keenen were both saying, like, Saturday Night Live they don't get black culture. Ever since Eddie left, you know, they're not even trying. They've given up on it. So this is the lane that is open for us. So, and that became In Living Color.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, wasn't Damon Wayans considered the next Eddie Murphy in terms of Saturday Night Live?
Sure, and I mean, right, and they brought him in, and I think I read about this in the book. I mean, it was kind of a disaster, and you know, it wasn't all Saturday Night Live's fault. I mean, Damon was, and I would arguably say probably still is, a pretty temperamental artist. And when he was brought into Saturday Night Live, it was really like, okay, you know, that was kind of the vibe. Here comes the next Eddie Murphy. This is the guy who's going to replace Eddie on Saturday Night Live. And to Lorne Michaels' credit, I think he was trying to protect Damon from having to live up to that, because I mean, to be fair, I mean, I would argue that Eddie Murphy is the most important performer in the history of Saturday Night Live. I mean, others may have done more on the show, but in terms of, I mean, there's a very, very compelling case to be made that Saturday Night Live would not have survived those years had they not have found Eddie Murphy. Mm-hmm. And you know, there was nothing to recommend about that show in those years besides Eddie Murphy. And he really kept it alive. And I forget which of the Saturday Night Live executives, but one of the key Saturday Night Live executives at that time was quoted as basically saying that without Eddie Murphy, Saturday Night Live would have died. But so when Damon went to Saturday Night Live, Lorne was trying to protect him, I think, and, you know, trying to protect him from those expectations. But what he was doing, you know, what Damon saw was, my boss isn't letting me do anything. You know, they're not giving me any sketches. I was just sitting here in the background, you know, playing like, you know, non-characters in sketches that aren't funny. And, you know, he got frustrated. And so
that's the Saturday Night Live black narrative almost. Yeah,
of course. And it's not like they've sorted it out that well, you know, since then. Mm-hmm. But the, you know, and the story is in the book, but it's not, you know, I think it's probably also in the Saturday Night Live oral history. But Damon, during a sketch where he was basically supposed to play this sort of straight-laced cop on Saturday Night Live, he was just so tired of not having anything to do on the show that he just basically played that straight-laced cop as if he was one of the guys in Men on Film. and Lorne fired him like on the spot after backstage at the show while it was going on, and I believe that's the only time that ever happened. He was you know, basically told to get out. Mm-hmm. You know, that's it. You can't do that. And you know, I think when I spoke to Damon about it, you know, I think Damon, you know, with years, you know, behind him now, like understands, you know, understands why he was fired and understands like that the opposing point of view. But at the same time, you know, at that time he was like, yeah, I think the way he put it is, I was a young, angry black man. And I felt like I wasn't getting an opportunity. I was being held back, and you know, so I wouldn't say that he necessarily regrets what he did, but I think he can see both sides of it now.
Well, speaking of Lorne Michaels, one of the differences between Keenen Ivory Wayans and Lorne Michaels is that in the writer's room, Keenen would hum the theme song from Deliverance. What was that supposed to symbolize when he would hum the theme song from Deliverance for the writers?
Well, so Keenen, to his credit, wanted writers to go for it in the writer's room. He didn't want them to hold back, and he didn't want people to be sort of, I guess, overly sensitive, or in particular, I don't think he wanted them to be sort of racially sensitive. And he didn't mind if a white writer pitched something that was like kind of, I don't want to say he didn't mind, but that was his way of telling a writer that they had fallen on the wrong side of why something is funny. It was particularly from a racial standpoint. Like, so, he wanted people to push that envelope, but it was always, it couldn't be making fun of black people or making fun of black culture. It was having fun with black culture. And there was like this very, it was an important distinction. Like, we're laughing with this, not at it. And so, but, look, it was a freewheeling, cutthroat writer's room, and people fell on the wrong side of that line all the time. And I guess my point is that, to his credit, yes, he would he would hum that Deliverance theme song when a writer was getting too, I guess, redneck with it, but he wouldn't fire them. He wouldn't exile them. He would just reel them in and say, yeah, that's not, on the wrong side of funny. And, and then you try again. And having interviewed probably 80 or 90% of the writers on the show, I mean, some of them had great experiences and some of whom had dreadful experiences. They would all vouch for the fact that Keenen he knew what he wanted on that show, and he really did have a vision for it. And and I think that even the writers who realized that they didn't fit that vision could respect that he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that thread of being culturally sensitive, because you're a white guy and you're obviously writing about all these like black comedy, right? And I would be remiss if I didn't point this out, but did you feel that gave you an edge as an outsider? Because sometimes you can look at a culture, like I'm in Canada, so we can look down, not necessarily look down, but look into America and see a completely different perspective of the American culture and how things are going and not going, versus being in America and the culture there. So did you feel that being a white dude and writing about this black comedy revolution, did that give you an advantage as an outsider?
I don't know if I'd say advantage. It gave me, like, I could only write it from my perspective. Like I wasn't going to pretend to be part of black culture. I mean, I for my entire adult life and before been like a huge admirer of black culture. Obviously that's sort of how I got into writing this book. But it's that sort of thing of you don't know what you don't know, and so I did have to sort of be careful a little bit in not trying to speak. I guess I was always cognizant of, this is my take on this story. An African American writer, a female writer, whoever would probably have written a different book. Might have been just as good, might have been better. I would probably want to read it. If it was well done. But it was something certainly that I thought about, and it was interesting, especially because although it's obviously this pioneering sort of black comedy show, a big significant percentage of the writers on the show were white. So they were sort of dealing with a version of the same thing I was dealing with, which is just, we want to, kind of go for it and, put our stamp on this. But, we have to realize that this isn't our show. And, it's not my show. It's a show I love. And, it sort of almost gets into like why the show fell apart when Keenen and the Wayans left, was because it did, regardless of who was writing the show and what, color they were, male or female, like Keenen, the show was Keenen's voice, or maybe arguably Keenen and Damon's voice. But that's kind of, that both gave the writers, cover and gave them kind of guidance.
Yeah, Keenen would take the hit for the team.
Right. Well, there was before the show even got on the air, it was just a pilot at this point, and there were all these sketches. There were sketches about Louis Farrakhan. There might have been
the Star Trek
Jesse
one.
Jackson. Yeah.
Yeah.
But and Fox, which was the executives at Fox, who were pretty much uniformly older white dudes, they saw this pilot and were worried. Mm-hmm. And they weren't, and I want to give them like some credit, and I feel like they were sort of worried for the right reason. They were sort of worried, like, are we being racist? Are we being, is this culturally insensitive? I mean, keep in mind, this is 1990, 1981, where those ideas weren't, as prominent in the culture as they are now, just in terms of like, let's be culturally sensitive. So they were really giving Keenen and the show, kind of the runaround, or maybe that's not the right way to put it. They were making them go through all these focus groups and, testing the show and research and blah, blah, blah. And Keenen would sit with these researchers, and they would ask him questions about the humor and this and that. And Keenen, it pissed Keenen off because, his point was that I'm an intelligent black man. I know what, I'm not insulting myself.
Mm-hmm.
I know better than you where that line is. And you don't do the same thing. The studio doesn't focus group, Woody Allen movies with like Jewish Americans. They don't focus group John Hughes movies with like the white people from the suburbs. Like, this he felt like he was being singled out just because they didn't get it.
Yeah.
And he eventually kind of put his feet down and won that argument. And I think that was an important argument to win in terms of setting the agenda for the show, because I think that he basically, let the Fox executives know, I'm running the show, I know how to run the show, and let me do it. And for a long time, that's why the show is successful. I think when they started trying to grasp more control of the show, mostly because it was successful, that's when Keenen got frustrated and left. So that was sort of both the beginning and the end of his time there.
I want to pick up at the end of the book. So your book, Homey, Don't Play That, the story of a living color in the Black comedy revolution, it closes off with this, I thought was a really significant point. You've been writing for like different magazines and outlets like the Rolling Stone, New York Times, Spin, Billboard. Mm-hmm. And you close Homey, Don't Play That with this quote: if there's a definite pattern around the demise of the Pryor show, Living Color, and Dave Chappelle show, there's an even larger framework this pattern fits into. Consider the career arcs of many of the top black comics of the past 50 years. And even throughout this conversation, one of your strengths seems to be seeing patterns. You start to see through the pop culture, you see patterns, and kind of like you kind of know almost like tea leaves, or like almost see where the river is kind of going. Can you somehow articulate or explain how you have that superpower, or as a gift, or as a writer? Because that's really cool in terms of cultural, because you're not just writing about like this show or anything like that. Like the subtitle of the book is The Black Comedy Revolution. You're seeing a pattern.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that's like one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me. But yet, I would say that like I definitely spent the better part of, I've pretty much spent my whole adult life like writing about pop culture and thinking about pop culture. And for most of the time, that's not a particularly useful thing to have, and I don't know if I'd call it a superpower, but it's not. It's definitely, but it's most of the time it just makes you like the guy at the party who knows the answer to like whatever trivia question. But I do think that I think that's a really sort of significant story in Black culture, and you know, you started to sort of, but basically the story is, and you know, this goes back to Richard Pryor, and actually before Richard Pryor, is that there are different pressures on, I'll say Black comedians, but I think that there are different pressures on Black sort of popular artists in general, you know, at least from sort of the 60s through, you know, the 2010 or whenever. You know, when you look at, there's this continuum of Black comics, and let's just, for argument's sake, start it with Richard Pryor. And you have Richard Pryor, and he kind of hands the baton to Eddie Murphy. And then, as I was talking about before, there's this kind of elbowing between Keenen and Arsenio and maybe Damon, Wayans a little bit, for who gets it from Eddie. Mm-hmm. Then it goes to, let's say, Chris Rock, and you know, but the disappointing thing about this story, and it kind of goes, you know, there's Chris Rock, and you can kind of see it going past Chris Rock to Chris Tucker and to Kevin, eventually, you know, sort of to Chappelle and to Kevin Hart maybe now. But the disappointing thing about this narrative is that, I don't know if it's the industry or the culture sees, well, we can only have one big sort of Black comic at a time, one big Black male comic, by the way, mm-hmm. at a time. And so I do think the sort of positive thing that has happened in, let's say, the last 5 to 10 years is that has broken down. And I do think that you do see now a lot more diversity in Black culture. Mm-hmm. You can have a Kevin Hart and a Donald Glover both being successful, you know, at the same moment, even though they're very, very different characters and their humor is very, very different. There's a much broader palette. You can have someone like, Issa, what's her name? I can't believe I'm forgetting her name now. She's got the HBO show Insecure. But anyway, Issa Rae.
Issa something?
Issa Rae.
Issa Rae,
I think
yes.
it's her name.
Yes.
You can edit that out if I said it wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Issa Rae. But there's just there's a much more of a multiplicity of voices now. Whether that will last, I kind of think it will. I do think that culture is changing, but for so long there was this story of, you know, each of these Black comics. You can put people like Martin Lawrence and Cat Williams, who all had their moment where they were kind of the guy. And if you look at the arc of their careers, it kind of goes the same way. You've got this, you know, big build, you get huge, and then it goes down quick. Now, they go down quick for different reasons, but if you look at Richard Pryor's show, In Living Color, and Chappelle's show, all of those shows ended on not the best terms, and kind of in some ways for similar reasons. And so, you know, it becomes a pattern that's hard to miss after a while. I do think, you know, things like Key and Peele and, you know, hopefully like Atlanta and Blackish, and I think, you know, you're seeing the story change a bit, maybe, at least for the time being. But yeah, those are definitely, I don't know, they're just things I think about.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Jagar, so when In Living Color was on, I went to a high school, Lemuel Collegiate, and it was very urban, to put it mild. And so In Living Color was like fantastic. Like everyone was always talking about the sketches the next day and all that kind of stuff. My friend Jagar, for one assembly, he actually dressed up as Homey D. Clown. And it was like some sort of International Women's Day or Celebrate Women or something. Anyways, as part of the sketch or whatever, he ended up bopping on the head a couple of girls, and so he got called to the principal's office because you're not supposed to bop women on the head. Right. But anyways, what was interesting was the teachers that stuck up for him. They were referencing, this is like the stuff we grew up with, like some of the older teachers. This is the stuff we grew up with, like this Three Stooges and that kind of physical comedy.
Sure.
And so it's interesting too, not just like in terms of Black culture, but just like how it even connects back to like comedy and culture itself. beyond just the obvious stuff that we were just talking about.
Yeah. I mean, and it is, hopefully it's all part of the same story, and we don't have to always splinter it off into like, just like you're saying. Yeah, it's not all. I mean, Keenan's I remember one of the shows that was like a huge pillar for him was the Carol Burnett show.
Mm-hmm.
He was a fan of like films like Airplane and Monty Python stuff. I mean, he was a ravenous kind of consumer of comedy, and so all of these things filter into that into that sensibility. I mean, you only need to look at probably the biggest star to come from that show was Jim Carrey.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously a white guy, which is it's a whole story in itself. But Jim Carrey, his sort of like Keenen could see that the comedy, that both the physical comedy and sort of the sensibility of Jim Carrey was going to work with what he wanted to do. The fact that there was nothing particularly black about Jim. I mean, Jim was Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
Is Canadian, I guess. But he knew that would work in what he had in mind. Keenan's influences. He was like a big Jackie Gleason fan. Like, I mean, he was definitely somebody who knew comedy.
Yeah. So the book is out now. Homey, Don't Play That: The Story of In Living Color and the Black Comedy Revolution. Thank you, David, for taking some time to talk to me about the old school In Living Color. It was fun to go down memory lane and to see the Fly Girls and the old hip hop and all the sketches and Handyman, Homey D Clown, Fire Marshal Bill, all those good stuff. So thank you. Where can people find you online?
Hopefully they can't. I'm on Twitter. I think it's at David Peisner, Peisner. I mostly try and work for a living. To keep like writing stories, and so if you Google me, you'll find whatever I've done lately.
Well, thank you, David, for taking the time. We covered a lot. I think we covered from like Three Stooges to Richard Pryor to Chappelle Show. So we covered a lot.
Yeah. Well, you did a good job then. All right, man. Well, thanks so much for taking the time and for being interested. Bye.
That was my interview with David Peisner. As I was saying to him at the end there, it was super fun to go back and to see all the In Living Color sketches. Fire Marshal Bill is ridiculous. Handyman still cracks me up. Arsenio was another one too, where Keenen Ivory Wayans had that big old butt. If you remember that. You know what's crazy too is I didn't put this together, but Living Color and Arsenio Hall ended within a week of each other in 1994. So that's surreal when you go back and you think about it. Like, when did the Arsenio Hall show end and when did In Living Color end? It was a week of each other in 1994. So those are some strange times. As I said, the book is Homey, Don't Play That: The Story of In Living Color and the Black Comedy Revolution. I highly recommend it. If you have a chance, pick it up. My name is Sammy Younan. This has been another fantastic episode of My Summer Lair. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I think the young kids call it Insta now. My pal Sammy. Jokes, yo.